So now that we looked at render preferences, we're gonna go ahead and try to make one test render. So to do that, we had render settings on, right? And this is where you set out all of your quality settings as well as your image type. And then the next window I want to show you is the render view window. So it's this button to the left of this toolbar, or you can also access it by going to Windows, Rendering Editors, Render View. And this window should pop up. Once you have your render view window open, go ahead and hit the first button. This is the render button. This tells your program to start rendering whatever view you assigned in your render settings. And now you can see that what I got is basically a black box, meaning I couldn't really render my image, and I have this warning sign in the bottom of my interface that says no light in scene. So basically what just happened is that Maya could not create an image because there's no lighting in my scene. So the same way the physical world functions, where in complete darkness you can't see anything, Maya is basically functioning the same way. So we need to add lights into our scene in order to actually see an image. To do that, we are going to look at two ways of adding lights. So one way is Maya's default light system, which is under the rendering tab. Make sure you're in the rendering submenu. These lights are Maya's lights, or the other way is using Arnold's lighting system, which can be located up here under the Arnold bar. You have lights right here. There's one extra step you need to take if you work with Maya lights, just because since we're going to be rendering in Arnold, you need to kind of tell these lights that there are certain settings for Arnold to be able to read them. But we'll look into this. So let's go ahead, and to start, we're going to create our first lights. And we're going to start with Maya's lights. So you can either go to Create Lights, or you can find these down here. I'm going to go to Create Lights, and I'm going to choose, let's go ahead and pick a spotlight to start with. So I have this spotlight. This arrow basically is telling me where my light is pointing to. And you can scale this up and down, and it won't really affect anything. It's just kind of the icon or the way to visualize your light. But what does affect it is its orientation. So let's go ahead and turn on our lights up here in your viewport. So it's this icon here. So you should be able to see your materials with lights. And if we move this spotlight, you'll see it starts to illuminate my scene. So let's say I wanted this to be a light bulb that's hanging from the top of my scene. I'm going to bring it up, and I want this light to actually point down towards my table. So if I go to my top view, I'll be able to center it correctly. There we go. I just noticed my candlestick is floating, so I'm going to bring it down. Okay, so you can see now that we're starting to light up our scene. And see, if I scale this up or down, it doesn't really affect the way my spotlight is illuminating my scene. So now let's go to the attribute editor to see the different settings for our light. Again, remember, this is a Maya light. We created it under this create bar. So since it's a Maya light, we need to do an extra step so that Arnold can actually read it. And before we go ahead and look at these settings, I'm going to show you how to use Arnold's real-time viewport rendering. So if you go to render under your viewport and switch from viewport 2.0 to Arnold, you'll get this small window. And then if you hit play, we're now seeing in our viewport something much closer to the way your actual image will look like in Arnold. So right now you can see that it's barely illuminating my scene, and that's because with a Maya light, you need to add this extra step of going under the Arnold tab and actually adding exposure to your scene. So if I start dialing this up, you'll see that I can start to illuminate my scene. And if you can't move this bar anymore, you can always dial it up by entering a number. So I'm gonna hit 20, for example. And maybe 20 is too much, but now I can just dial this back down a bit. I can also work with intensity, and so basically intensity is more for fine-tuning your image, whereas exposure works a little bit more exponentially. Another thing that we can work with is radius. So this is the radius of your light. See, if I make this larger, it's illuminating a larger area. And other than this, there's other settings, for example, roundness or shadow density. You can go ahead and kind of play with these a little bit. And the great thing about having this viewport renderer with Arnold is that in real time you can start to see how these settings will actually affect your final image. You can also, for example, change the color of your light. So if you wanted to illuminate with a different color, for example, blue, if you wanted to illuminate your scene with a blue light, you can change that. You can also change the type of light here. So if you created a spotlight and instead of that you want to switch to an area light, you can switch it directly here in this menu. I'm going to go back to spotlight. So feel free to experiment with these different lights and see what kind of effects they all have. For example, I can have a wider or a smaller cone angle in case I wanted to really emphasize lighting a specific object. I'm going to bring this color back to white. And now let's go ahead and create another light. So let's try and create a point light this time. So I'm going to leave this light as is, and then I'm going to go to create, lights, and point light. A point light shows light in all directions. So contrary to the spotlight that actually points the way a flashlight would to one direction, a point light illuminates all around. So I'm going to place it here so you can see. And again, let's go to the Arnold tab under the attribute settings, and remember we need to dial the exposure up so that this light actually works with Arnold. And once we have it up, we can again dial it down a bit. Maybe this point light is closer to where my candlestick is. Maybe I can simulate the light from my candle with this one, for example. If for some reason you put it inside of the mesh, it won't really be illuminating because this material is not a transparent material. So it's like having a light inside of a box. It won't really be illuminating outside. That's why it's important to make sure that it's not inside your mesh. We'll look into adding a transparent material, for example, for our lampshade, and then adding a light bulb inside so that you can see the difference. So now that I dialed the exposure up, again, we can change the radius, or we can change the samples. The more samples you add, the higher quality your lighting will be, but it will also take longer to render. So, for example, like this. And again, you can work with a different color for your light, or you can change the shadow color, for example, if you wanted your shadows to be a different color. So there's different settings that you can look into and experiment with in each light. The one thing to make sure is that if you are using Maya lights, you need to make sure there's exposure under the Arnold tab. Now we're going to look into some Arnold lights. So let's go ahead and click on Arnold lights, and let's select an area light. So an area light behaves sort of like a softbox, and this line shows you the direction to where the light is pointing. So if I bring this to my side, you'll see that I'm actually illuminating the legs of my table. And now let's go and look at this light's attributes. So again, you can change the color of your light, and you can work with exposure and intensity to properly illuminate your object. Take into account that exposure is more of a geometric control, so it works on powers of 2. So for example, if you switch exposure to 2, you're actually quadrupling the intensity of the light. Whereas when you're working with intensity, it's a linear control. So this is more for fine-tuning. We can change the shape of our light. So we can turn it, for example, into a disc. We can also change the spread. So if we put it at 0, the light is not spreading at all, and it's the same size of our area light. But if we change this to a higher number, we'll see the light is able to spread outwards more. And let's see what happens if we scale this light. So contrary to the spotlight, this light, its scale does affect the amount of light and the area where it's lighting your scene. This has to do because it's like imagining the size of this softbox. So if you have a larger softbox, it's obviously going to illuminate a larger area. Whereas with a flashlight, even if you have a larger flashlight, the light is more directional. So again, there's other settings that you can look into and play around with if you want. For example, the color of your shadows and your shadow density. Now we're going to create another light, but before we do that, I want to illuminate the same way that I'm illuminating the legs of my table here. I want to have them here in the front. So to do this, I'm going to hit Shift D, and I'm going to duplicate this light. So now you can see I have 2 area lights, and I'm going to drag one of them over here. Make sure that this line is pointing towards the table. Okay, so we have our area lights, and now I want to show you another Arnold light that is called mesh light. What mesh light does is it basically uses an object as a light source. So to do this, let's try and illuminate the fire in our candle. So we're going to select this sphere, this deformed sphere, and with it selected, you're going to go to Arnold, Lights, and select Mesh Light. So now if you click away, you see this has disappeared. This is because Arnold by default is telling this light to emit, but not to preserve or make it visible. It's only emitting light. So if we first dial the exposure up so that we can see that it's working, and then if we click on light visible and activate this box, you should be able to see it now. So now this is going to look kind of like a LED fake candle that's lighting up. Let's change these settings a little bit. Let's make this a little bit more intense, but maybe dial the exposure down a little bit. And we have again the shadow color. So as you can see here, when you're using Arnold lights, you have all the settings integrated under this first tab, whereas with Maya lights, you have to go I'm clicking on a spotlight, for example, you have to go to the Arnold tab to find the exposure settings. Okay, so now that we have a couple lights in our scene and we're using this Arnold viewport rendering to see that it's actually working, let's go ahead and try and create one render. So let's go back to render settings, and let's say we want to make a JPEG, and we want to call it, maybe we want to call it test render. And then let's just say that this size is fine, 960 by 540, because we just want to test how this image looks like. So let's open our render view window and then hit render. And you can see that, first of all, my Arnold render view under my viewport turned off because it's using this engine to actually create the image now. And you can see that now you can see something, whereas before we had this black rectangle. So again, this is because we've added lights into our scene and we're actually illuminating it. So you should get something like this. I'm going to go ahead and frame maybe a better view to try and render again. If you go to your viewport layout and you select the resolution gate, this will help you get an idea of how your image is cropping and framing within the area of your image size. So I like this view better, so I'm going to go ahead and again open my render view and render this again. Okay, and now you can see if you go to your project folder, under images, there's a temp folder, and Maya should have saved your image under that folder, so you should be able to see it there. If for some reason it didn't save, or you want to save it with a different name, you can go to File, Save Image, and then just save it here. It's still under my images folder. So you can call it test render 2 and save it. Okay, so now you have a general overview of how lights work in Maya and how to render an image in your scene.